I have a tendency to get very passionate, and that's something I like about myself. I think passion is really important and good for creation and self-improvement. Once again, this is not an attack, this is not meant in malice, these are intended to be critiques. And I try my best not to go too hard or too easy on the people I challenge. I do want to say I would not be going as hard on this comic if it weren't as big as it is. I think it's very important that something as large and impactful as 5 years later be the best possible version of itself. If I didn't like something, I wouldn't try to make it better. And I want the fandom and this comic to be the best possible version of itself. This is the second addition to my series breaking down the Ink Tanks fan comic 5YL. We're moving right on to Chapter 2, The Lonely Ghost. Kuro was kind enough to leave a comment on my last video, which brought a lot of things to light. First off, in pre-production, this was intended to exclusively be a Danny Phantom comic. Kuro added Ben, and things escalated from there. It was the Ben 10 fandom that ended up being more attracted to this comic than the Danny Phantom fandom, so it makes sense to cater to them more. I still stand by my point that there's a slight bias towards Danny. I'll touch on this lightly here, because I feel like this is something that's better addressed in full when I've gotten further into the review of the comic. But let's take this moment to compare Danny and Ben's introduction. Danny got 8 pages, Ben got 4. And I will say, that's in major part because Danny's narration led to the continuation of the story, while the only purposes Ben served was to be a parallel to Danny's intro in Chapter 1. Quite literally, it's only fair if I get to tell my side of the story too. I have a lot of the same issues with Ben's narration as I did with Danny's, in that opening with a summary of a backstory tends to serve for a very poor hook. Ben's is a bit stronger because it feels more enthusiastic. I personally think that page 4 is the strongest visually. Page 2 of Alienated was pretty good too, but there were a lot of things throwing off the balance of the page. Danny's logo should be a lot bigger. I didn't even notice it at first when I was skimming through the pages. The logo should be almost as eye-catching as Danny himself, to help bring out the excitement and attention of the reader. And Danny has a very dramatic pose here, which is good, but Vlad's is very static, which really drains the energy of the page. That's actually a pretty consistent problem throughout the comic. A lot of poses are very stiff. It doesn't feel that animated. I'll talk about it more when I come across more examples. Now, Vlad's backstory is a bit more engaging than Danny's and Ben's, and is mostly due to less being more. There's a weight of emotion from the lack of narration. There is a major issue though. Why are we coming out of one backstory just to jump straight into a different backstory? It would have flowed better if you had ended with Jack, you old fool, which alludes to his history without front-loading the reader. As it is now, the comic's wheels are spinning in the mud, and even though there were 2 epic fights, I still feel like the story hasn't even really started, like Chapter 2 is still the prologue. There's also the issue of formatting, which kind of dampens the emotional impact. If they were trying to go for something intense and dramatic, the panels are too static, the border too dull and rigid, and the size and ratio of the panels massively curbs the action. If they were trying to go for something depressing and melancholy, it's too punchy, and the colors are too consistently bright. It's just sad to see this page almost reach its full potential, but miss it. This panel is especially egregious. The bright walls and the candy clocks. Once again, if you're trying to go for a depressing vibe, it's too bright, and if you're trying to go for something psychedelic and mind-altering, the room isn't bright enough, and the clocks are too contained within the window. I've said this in the past, but I especially mean it this time. This is extremely confusing. I don't know what it is that I'm supposed to feel from this, or what it's trying to convey. I really like the detail of the wilted flowers and the implied passage of time, but I feel like the framing and the detail of the... No, Kuro, no! Why did you do this? Why would you do this? Look, in the last video I felt bad about going too hard on Kuro, but I can't treat this with gentle gloves. Why did you Doctor Strange him? More importantly, why did you put this here right out of the blue? I'm not interested in this at all. I never wondered how Vlad got his costume because I assumed it was just something that helped visually convey his character. He's campy, flamboyant, over the top. He's a typical cartoon villain. And by giving his outfit this backstory, saying he was a part of a secret society, especially with this dark and tragic tone, you're actually taking away from Vlad's character. You've made him less complex because you're removing his fun, campy nature and making it all tragic. And I get it, he just came back from 5 years of solitude. But then this backstory, or at least this much of it, shouldn't be here. You're summarizing his character under the mask of tragedy. It's like you took the Jack Horner out of him. What pains me is that I'm certain that there's a way to convey this story that's actually engaging and interesting. But the timing, the tone, the pacing, the formatting, the layout, it's all wrong. I have to say that it fails. I can't lie and say that it works. That doesn't help you. That doesn't help anyone. This needs to be either completely redone or just straight up removed. Minor point about the color on page 9. The yellow background makes this panel look like the highlight of the page, but that's not what the narrative highlight is. The narrative highlight should be just about everything else. I would throw away the yellow, swap it with something that blends a bit more with the red and is less saturated. I mean, right now, it's literally highlighter yellow. And maybe add more color to the second panel so it doesn't really blend in with the fourth. It could also definitely use some size variation. And I'm sorry, but I have to slightly roast you. This is a really funny picture. Make this an emote or something. It does not convey the distraught feeling that follows it in the next panel. You hide Maddie and Jack's eyes in the forefront. I feel like something similar should be done with Vlad, especially since he's farther away and he's feeling this intense emotion. It's just not being conveyed with this meme reaction. My guy, please draw eyes smaller. I almost shat myself. Also, Danny looks so ominous here. I wouldn't draw him like that, even if he's in the background. Unless he's contemplating murder. So, lore issue with page 20. Danny says that once he enters a ghost portal, the map should be able to take him home. The problem is, the map canonically can find the nearest ghost portal and automatically take him. Why doesn't he try that? Why isn't there at least one line addressing that? It feels like a major oversight. Now, page 21. See, I started out by realizing that the physics in this panel were wrong. If she were moving in this direction, then her feet should be angled against that, so she could properly stop. I wanted to fix that really quickly, just to show what I meant, but then I realized that the panel didn't really work. So I tried going the route of completely reworking 1 or 2 panels. But then I realized the whole page didn't really work. I've mentioned before that a lot of pages had formatting issues, but I realized that this was a perfect opportunity to explain how. The eye isn't really guided coherently through the page. The way Danny, Rook, and Driba are arranged doesn't really lead anywhere. And I can imagine the thought process behind the bottom half of the page. Lula is moving to the left in the top panel, then to the right in the bottom, which guides the reader to Lula in the final panel. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. Instead, the combination of the 2 images creates an arrow pointing directly to Lula, and the framing of her in the final panel, in the fact that she's close to the camera and blocking a lot of space, along with being at an awkward angle, makes her essentially act like a wall. It feels claustrophobic. It's very flat and visually uninteresting. So, I completely redrew the whole page. I tried to figure out the layout, the positioning, how I wanted the reader's eye to move across the page. I started to experiment with angles. And then, okay, Lula's running in here really quickly. I wanted to portray that with more than just speed lines, so I added a shot of Danny being surprised by the wind she creates. It helps us get into Danny's shoes, the way he feels like a fish out of water in this new universe that he's unfamiliar with. We get to feel the world physically interact with him. Then I worked on Lula, and I really like the pose I had going for her. I really like the idea of Lula coming toward the reader like she's stopping in front of us to deliver news. I'm an absolute sucker for dynamic poses, so I tend to end up sketching things that are pretty complex. I stood in front of the mirror at some really awkward angles and almost pulled a muscle. But still, very worth it. Would recommend. I wanted Danny to point, just to make him feel a tiny bit more animated. I added the door, and I didn't want Danny's reaction to take up the page, so I tried to make it small, like a visual footnote. And of course, the final isn't perfect. It definitely still needs a lot more work. And I definitely wouldn't say that this is the best possible version of this page. I just think this is enough to convey my point. And while I was on the topic of redraws, I said in the last video that Rook's face was wrong, but I didn't really expand on that, so let's touch on that lightly here. We keep seeing his head at this angle, where we normally see both eyes, but with him we only see one at a time. It doesn't really look right, so I made his face a little bit more flat. I gave him the classic DJW jawline that we all know and love him for, and then I realized his body was too big, so I shrunk it down a bit, adjusted a few details, and there it is. I also had an issue with his lower lip. It made his face look a bit uneven in terms of distribution of realism to comic style. And title drop. Kind of. So that's pretty much it for this chapter. I tried to communicate my point without being excessive. I highly recommend the book Framed Ink by Marcos Mateo Mestre. Probably butchering that, but it's Framed Ink. Here's the name and author. I got it at my local library. It's very good. It's very helpful with how to guide the reader's eye, explaining what to convey in a page, and how to make important parts more significant. It's a very good book. So that's it for this chapter. I'll see you in the third video. Have a good day and a good life.